I absolutely love this time of year. As I'm sitting down to watch the Champions League final, making this video, it's only a few weeks before the Premier League starts again. The tables have been reset, the points are back to zero, and a new campaign is about to start. As usual, nobody can really expect what's going to happen, but I'm hoping that the team where I was born are going to be champions of England again. Predicting the outcome of fantasy football is even harder though. So this is why I've made this video. It's why you and me lost Fantasy Premier League last year, analysing the data 2019-2020. For those of you who don't know how Fantasy Premier League works, you get to pick a team of 15 players, 11 play each week, there's a set number for each position, and at the end of the week you can make one transfer. So you can take out a player and put in another one. Last year's statistics is available to us, so if you go onto the statistics page you can look through all the players. So this is based on total points from last season, but you can also do stuff like number of assists they got, any bonus points, or even this ICT index, which we'll discuss later in the video. I wrote something called a web scraper, which goes through that statistics page and it extracts all the data which might be useful, because there's no download button on the website. So I collected stuff like the players' positions, their cost, the points that they got this season, the club they play for, and then also lots of other smaller details like the points per game value you can collect, clean sheets, number of minutes they've played this season, goals scored, etc, etc, etc. Once I've collected all that data, we can then do some analysis of it. So here I've printed out the data we've collected. You can see all these features in different columns for the different player names. I then created a few columns of my own based on those already given to us. So you've got games played, which I calculate from the number of points divided by the points per game and save that as an integer. Then we've also got the bonus points per game and the ICT index per game. I also created this value column here. So this is based on the notion that a player's price should be the number of points they average per game week. So you can work out whether or not you're going to get your money back by buying a player by taking the points they score per game and subtracting the cost from that. And it's too high of a bar, let's put it that way. The cost is always larger than the points per game, so this is always a negative value. But then by taking an absolute value and dividing the points per game by this money back, we can get a metric to work out how valuable a player is. Do the number of points they get per game on average, does that seem to be a decent level compared with the price they will cost us? So the ideal situation is they're very high scoring on points per game and their money back score is very low. So we're quite likely to get our money back and they score a huge number of points. From here we can then look at the data a bit further. So you can see I've plotted some tables and these are what I'm going to discuss in more detail. This video for some of you will be really dry and I apologize in advance, but for others it might be really interesting. So yeah, let's see how you find it. Okay, so before I start getting into the nitty-gritties, there's a few caveats that we need to talk about. So firstly, this is considering last year's data only. So this means there's a lot of things which aren't included. For example, the newly promoted teams aren't in the data, so Fulham, West Brom, Leeds, you won't see any of their names coming up. It doesn't include any new signings for teams, so Timo Werner going to Chelsea this summer. It doesn't take into account any transfers between teams, so that includes Willian going to Arsenal or Ramsdale going to Sheffield United. And it doesn't take into account any changes in Fantasy Premier League positions. So I don't know if you've seen yet, but Aubameyang is now a midfielder. Ritchie, who plays for Newcastle, is now considered a midfielder as well from being a defender. There's quite a few changes there. Definitely worth considering as we go through this. And yeah, the big one is I'm not going to take any responsibility if you don't win Premier League next year, but I will take full responsibility if you do win it. So that's all said and done. The big thing here is that we're including the prices from this year, but the data from last year. So the question I'm trying to ask is, if a player performs the same as they did last year with their new price, are they still worth buying this year? So I mean, we'll get through it, but for example, the big name is Kevin De Bruyne. You know, his price I think's gone up this year, maybe by $1 million or $500,000. Is he still worth buying this year again or not? Bruno Fernandes, he was 8 million at the end of the year. Now he's 10.5 million. Is he still worth the money, or is he now too expensive? So starting off, looking at goalkeepers. So on the y-axis, you'll see points per game, and then we have the value feature, which I've already talked about, and also the cost. So the right-hand graph is useful if you're trying to look for a player who is within a certain price range and is going to score you points. How do you pick which one to go for? So for example, in the 4.5, the real budget goalkeepers, it looks like McCarthy from Crystal Palace and Matt Ryan from Brighton are the ones that you probably want to be going for over Tom Heaton at Burnley and Gazzaniga at Tottenham. But when we look at the graph on the left for value, you see that Lloris, his points per game to his price is actually very reasonable. So the ideal situation in most of these graphs is that you're in the top right hand corner of the graph when it comes to value against points per game. So Lloris, probably due to his injury, because he missed a lot of games at the end of last season, but he was consistently averaging 4 to 5 points per match. That's a lot of clean sheets, a lot of bonus points, and also, yeah, so his price range I think was 5.5 million this season coming up, and he's averaging 4 to 5 points. So that means you're only really losing about $500,000 on buying him. Other notable names, so anyone kind of above the line, these are people who are performing above the average. Pope and Henderson, they both had fantastic seasons last year. Henderson, of course, moving back to Man United, so Ramsdale's taking his place. It'll be interesting to see, therefore, if Ramsdale's someone you'd want to swap in for Henderson or not. But yeah, so interesting stuff so far. Ederson and Alisson are the big name goalkeepers, I think, and you can see that they don't really seem to get quite there. So Alisson outperforms Ederson for points per game, but for their price tag, they're not really above that line that you see on the right. I mean, probably because both teams don't get that many shots taken against them. They don't make that many saves. They lose a lot of points from those kind of things. Secondly, looking at defenders, there's a name immediately stands out in that left graph, Marcos Alonso for Chelsea. So Marcos Alonso averaged 5.7 points per game last year when he played. He played under half the matches, but when he played, he scored big. So his value is very, very reasonable. But then you can see that, that points per game is not quite as high as Alexander-Arnold, but I think he's the second highest on points per game. So if Frank Lampard decides that Marcos Alonso is starting for him next season, it's up in the air. I think they're looking at getting Chilwell in, so we'll have to see what happens. But if not, if he performs the same as he did last year, he looks like a very reasonably priced player to go for. And then the big names you'll see really stand out. So Alexander-Arnold, Robertson, Van Dijk, all the Liverpool players consistently keeping clean sheets. But then a few names which maybe you're slightly surprised to see. So Doherty and Bolly, the Wolves defenders, they scored very well for their price points. And then also Pereira, I think, was quite a big name for Leicester City. I think a lot of us knew about him in fantasy football. Chilwell the same. One that stood out for me is Burnley's Bardsley. So he is worth 4.5 million this year. If he's going to start a right back for Burnley, he could be worth considering as a cheap alternative defender to go for there. But yeah, as you can see on the right, comparing the goalkeepers for the different price points, those that appear higher up on the list, preferably above that yellow diagonal line, they're ones where it is probably worth picking them up in your team for their cost to points per game ratio. So Azpilicueta, Digne might be a little too expensive for the points per game they're likely to give us next season. But you never know. You never know at all. Moving on to the midfielders, and here a few names stand out again. So Fernandes is the far and beyond the player in the top right hand corner of the left hand graph. So for his value, the points per game he was getting is just ridiculous. He may have only played half the season since January, but the performance and the shift he was putting in is absolutely massive. So despite his price going up from 8 till 10.5 or whatever his new price is, Definitely someone worth considering for next season to pick up. The other two names which stand out on the far right hand side in terms of quite high value players, not necessarily high points but high value, Lundstrom and Ritchie. So these were both players who were marked as defenders last year, but this year are down as midfielders. So they're going to lose a lot of points, I think. I think they're kind of red herrings in these curves because they're not going to get those clean sheets they might have got last season, because they'll now be midfielders. They'll only get 1 point instead of 4 for that. But there's a few other names maybe that stick out. Pulisic was someone I had in my team towards the end of the year, and he seems to be a pretty good pick for points per game at Chelsea. Trying to work out who you're going to go for. Maybe you'll go for Timo Werner, the new signing, but that's totally up to you. Willian maybe at Arsenal for value. So Aubameyang scores more points, but Aubameyang's also been moved to a midfielder now as well. So you've got to consider, is he going to lose points, or maybe he'll get more points because goals will now be worth an extra point for him. And he'll also get potential clean sheets. But then Willian at Chelsea was performing very well. Arsenal, can't really think of a big midfield name for them in that team that's really like working the engine. Aubameyang was definitely their star player, so maybe he can get in and get quite a few points for them. And then on the right hand side with this cost curve, you can see those players which it seems are going to be getting a lot of points for the cost that they are, and those that maybe are going to struggle a little bit more. So interestingly, Liverpool, Salah, Mane, the big two names there, but it seems like Mane for his price point might actually not be quite as worth the money that Salah is. Salah does tend to get a couple more goals or a few bonuses here and there. Mane not quite catching up in the same way, even though potentially some consider him the more influential or the better of the two. But fantasy football wise, maybe go for Salah. And Aubameyang again, his price has really moved up this season, so is he actually worth going for this year if you're looking for that big name striker? Moving on to the official strikers, it seems ironic considering so many of those midfielders basically play as strikers. But yeah, once again, you're looking for the top right-hand corner in the first graph here. So Martial and Antonio seem to be up there. Antonio very reasonably priced. He did get that 4 goals in one of the games. That's probably helped him out here a lot. But yeah, his price point to his value seems quite high. So if you're looking for a cheap budget striker, Antonio for West Ham, I'd probably consider going for him. Martial for Man United, also another one that seems to be performing very well. His value is quite high, so he scores pretty much the equivalent of points to his price, but he also gets a lot of points each game. Then yeah, other ones who are kind of quite high away from this curve, so Vardy, Aguero, Kane, they're all doing quite well for themselves for their price point. So if we go again to the right hand curve and we look at the costs, Martial, you know, he's quite a way above everyone else there. Ings and Jimenez, very, very small differences. Ings maybe just over Jimenez, but then again, Wolves had a lot of games at the start of the year where they really struggled when they were in Europe. So you know, will his performance actually pick up? Who knows? It's going to be very hard to see. And then in terms of budget strikers, I've already mentioned Antonio, but then IU at Crystal Palace, he's 6 million it seems. He seems to be the one you'd go for if you're looking for a cheap striker there. And then maybe even Burnley's Chris Wood is another option for a budget striker that seems to be performing quite well. So then moving on to this influence creativity threat index. So this is a metric that FPL uses to work out kind of how influential a player is on the match. So it's really interesting to see that for most of the positions that people play in, the higher they cost, the more influence they have on the match. But for goalkeepers, it seems to be the other way. And this is probably because of the teams they're playing for. So Alisson and Ederson are very high cost, but they have very little influence. And that's likely just because they play on teams that dominate possession for the whole match. So the likelihood of them seeing much of the ball is quite low. I know Ederson has this rep of, gets the assists. Alisson got one last year, but there are a few other goalkeepers that last season managed to get an assist. And I think it's not necessarily picked up by BBC, but it is picked up in these stats. Another interesting note is Henderson there. So Henderson for Sheffield United, we saw him very high up on the points per game. But if you see here, his influence is actually quite low. And I think that's because Sheffield United's defence is so good as a unit that he doesn't necessarily have to make many saves. While Pope, on the other hand, is a very similar keeper in terms of playing for this kind of mid-team mid-position team, but he makes a lot more saves than Henderson did last season, even more so than Schmeichel and these other keepers. So if you were trying to make the choice between Pope and Henderson, I know Henderson's at United, so whether he plays ahead of De Gea is a good question, but you'd probably want to go for Pope there out of the two. Then again, midfielders, the big influence players, Fernandes, De Bruyne, Salah, all standing out there right at the top of the board. That's it is relative to their cost, but Fernandes is just so far higher than everyone else, isn't he? And then again, Ritchie and Lundstram stand out for me towards the bottom, but they aren't midfielders. They aren't defenders anymore. They're classed as midfielders, so it is worth keeping a check on that. But anyone kind of above that line, if they perform the same as they did last year, they look like they're valued very nicely for the season coming up. Defenders, bottom left, once again we've kind of touched on the big players there, Alonso, Alexander-Arnold, Robertson, but this is where it's interesting for influence. Digne and Azpilicueta have a lot of influence on the game. In the previous curve I showed you, they were below the line, so it seemed like maybe they're a little expensive for the points they get, but you can see they really have high influence on the match. So picking those players, Everton, they've got Ancelotti now. Digne could be a player that's really influential in that team, especially if they start performing better than they did last year. Another player, Emerson and Alonso obviously will be kind of fighting it out for who plays for Chelsea next season, unless Chilwell arrives and then it's a three-way battle. But another player that you look at has a lot of influence on the game as a defender compared with other players. And then finally again at strikers, so Antonio, he stands out for me. So not only does he seem to get quite a lot of points when he plays for West Ham, but he's the guy. He has all the influence on the team, and he really picks up a lot of points when it comes to being creative, threatening and influential for West Ham. Whether or not they get the goals and the question mark over the whole team is something you've got to consider. But if you are going to go for a West Ham player, Antonio's probably the guy you'd want to be going for. Other names that stand out, Jimenez over Ings here. So Jimenez seems to have more of an influence over the whole team than Ings does. That could be related to the play style, so Ings might be a bit more of a lone striker. So if Southampton struggle, Ings doesn't see the ball, he can't be influential, he can't be creative, he can't threaten. Jimenez, Wolves do kind of play a bit of a possession game, so maybe he just gets more touches on the ball that way, and so he's able to have a bit more of an influence, more likely to get bonus points that way. And then again, another player who maybe stands out for the opposite reasons, Lacazette's really doesn't seem to have much of an influence on the match. This is all per game, so this isn't, injuries aside that aren't counted, this is per match that they perform, and Lacazette seems to not actually have that much influence on the match as a whole compared to other players at his price point. And finally, bonus points. This is always really hard to see. Often it's given to the person who scores the most in the match. But what about the 0-0s or the 1-1s? Who starts picking up points there? Or who's that player that sometimes just randomly gets a point and you're kind of confused why? Well, here the players, this is once again bonus points per game. The players that stand out in terms of getting points regularly are Bruno Fernandes, Ings, Rashford, Vardy, De Bruyne, Aubameyang. Salah and Mane both below the line. I think this is probably because when Liverpool play, often it feels like either Salah scores or Mane scores, but it's always one or the other. So they've probably ended up halving the bonus points they would have got if they were just, imagine one player scored the goals for Liverpool. You'd see them a lot higher, kind of the Aubameyang there, but because they split them between themselves, they end up splitting the bonus points as well. So that's where for bonus points those two seem to struggle a little bit more. Same can probably be said for someone like Alexander-Arnold. Less bonus points per game compared to some other players, but maybe that's just because Liverpool spread out so much of the points between them as a whole. So here I think for bonus points you're really looking for players that have a lot of influence on their team as an individual. So Willian for Chelsea last year, he's the name that stands out for me around the 8 million cost. Alonso's also up there, but he did play significantly less games than Willian did. But that's another question. Willian at Arsenal, will he perform the same as he did? If he does, he seems to be a very reasonably priced player to think about. IU again for Crystal Palace, cheap player. Dunk for Brighton. A lot of influence there, and a lot of bonus points that these guys seem to be picking up. Anyway, you know, I don't want this video to be too long, so you're more than welcome to go back and freeze frame on those clips and those graphs to see for yourself what you think about them. The conclusions I make, I think Bruno Fernandes, if he performs the same as he did last year, I think he's I think we should all be picking him. He had such a phenomenal Fantasy Premier League half season that he did. But other than that, yeah, it's, you know, you never know, do you? I've never won it. I've never got even in the top 100,000. So best of luck to you, and I hope any of my information has helped. If you were one of the few people that probably enjoyed this video, or you just like really in detailed videos like this, do check out my other video I made which discusses anime and why it's something that's actually worth your time and not just for children. And also drop a comment, let me know if you want me to make another video. Maybe I will. I can't promise anything, but I do enjoy making them, and if I've got topics to make, maybe I will. Anyway, thanks guys, God bless, and goodbye.